You know, one of the things that your description of those mice reminds me of is in Carter G. Woodson's book, Miseducation of the Negro. And he talks about how the education that we receive, he says to the effect that this is not a direct quote, I don't have it in front of me, but when you control a man's thinking, you do not have to tell him to go around to the back door. He
That's
will
right.
go to the back door because his education makes it so. And if there is no back door, he will cut one out for his benefit because his education requires it. And that to me is an understanding as to that's what comes up for me as I hear you talking about epigenetics, because we sometimes act as though our responses or our reactions to instances of racism or systematic oppression is something that we logically can decide without realizing
Right.
that our responses are largely, I don't want to say pre-programmed, but the materials through which our responses are generated is largely about drawing on what the epigenetic teaching, what our education, both our proactive and explicit education in school systems, and what our epigenetic ancestral memory is holding on to. And we see that a lot in the examples you give, and just the way that we parent. And in this book, I remember the first time I read the
Yeah.
book, it was before we was married. We might have just gotten married. This was like 2004, 2005. But I remember the examples you give about the way we parent and how even that was passed down. And one of the concepts that my husband, my then boyfriend, fiance, and now husband took away from that was this idea that what it means to be, for example, a good parent on a slave plantation, and what it means to be a good parent where you're trying to create freedom off of a slave plantation. Good, both trying to be good parents, but the skills necessary to navigate those circumstances and conditions are not the same. If I am the parent of a daughter, and I believe I heard you give this example. Although, quite frankly, anything related to post-traumatic slave syndrome in my head is just what Dr. Joy said. Although I've realized in some years, it may not have always been Dr. Joy. It might have been some other people, but I believe I once heard you or somebody who had studied under you talk about the fact that as a parent on a slave plantation, if I have a daughter, as she's coming of age, yes, I'm going to teach her about her body, but that might also require that I teach her how to be gang assaulted and make it out on the other side of that assault, and the realities of what we had to navigate in those moments, and how we have sort of held on to those parenting lessons. And talk to us a little bit about how it shows up not just even in our biochemical makeup and our physical response, but even in our philosophic approach to how we live and how we navigate the world in which we find ourselves.
Well, God, there's so many things were floating through my head as you were talking. My God, very well done. Actually, that is one of the examples that I do give in terms of preparing children to be harmed, because that is part of their lives. And part of what you're talking about is adaptive behavior, survival
Mm,
behavior. We learn to
mm,
survive in whatever conditions. During war, you'll have children, again, I talk about this in the book, I think, or one of the other documents that I've written, that they would pretend war. You'd have one child that would shoot the other child would fall into the ditch, and they would go back and forth. These are children's games
mm.
based on what they were seeing around them, which seems like a horrific thing, but for them it was the reality. No, this time I'll play the person shot. And so I think that when we start looking at it from a broader perspective, and maybe easier for people to kind of understand, it's something called learned helplessness,
Mm.
right? So learned helplessness, once again, was something that was done with animals. And in the case that I'm speaking about, they were doing it with dogs, not the salivation story. It's not the salivation, not the ringing the bell and the salivating. This was, they wanted to once again see what dogs would do if they turned on a red light wherever they were. Didn't matter whether it's red, a light, and then shock the dogs,
Mm.
right? And the dogs that were in this caged area would run away from that area to where there was a no shock happening. So they would run. And once again, it got to the point where they didn't, all they had to do was turn on the light. They
Wow.
didn't have to shock them. Dogs would run. So then they did one more thing that probably would not be in any way ethical.
Mm.
They decided, let's see what the dogs will do if we shock them, regardless to whether the light is on or off.
Oh my God.
And you know what the dog does? The dogs will lie down and stop moving,
Mm.
because what they have learned This
Mm.
is learning, right? Learned helplessness is that no matter what I do, it will not change the outcome. That also happens to human beings. And what we do, and it's very interesting, when I think about when I work with elders, myself, I'm now an elder, but talking to folks from different parts of the country, Black people, about how and why they move the way they do through the world. And I give the example of being in a room. And the last time I gave this example, I was speaking in DC. I think it was like a week ago, I was in DC. And I said there were two officers in the room there, and the two officers were there really to protect me. I mean, they had
Mm.
security. And these are two Black men that are standing over in the corner. I use them as examples. I said, say, for example, the door that they're standing next to, they're guarding. And anyone that goes near the door is severely beaten or killed
Mm.
because they're guarding the door.
Right.
After a while, nobody goes to the door.
Nope.
Okay, they're standing there, they're guarding the door. Nobody even sees them. They're not going anywhere near the door because they've learned that if you go near the door, you'll be beaten or killed. Well, time passed, and there are no people at the door, no guards at the door. Right? No, they're gone. Guards are gone. In fact, not only are the guards gone, the door is ajar
Oof.
and the people won't go out.
Mm.
And what we do as a society, and especially when it comes to Black people or people of color, is they go, gosh, isn't it odd that they're not going out of the door?
Mm.
Let's find out why they're not going out of the door. Let's do some research. Let's do a study to determine why they're not going out of the door. And then let's do, get a control group. And next thing you know, you're doing a study of the study. Now someone has published there. I said, but no one, not a single person would think, you know what? What's your name? Your name is Alice. Alice, come on, walk with me. Let's walk out the door.
Mm.
Immediate self-efficacy. Because if you were to ask Alice why you haven't gone out the door, well, you have something called vicarious learned helplessness. Well, nobody I know ever went out the door.
Mm.
Nobody I respected ever went out the door. I don't need to go out the door. There's nothing out there. Nothing for me. I haven't been out the door so far. You see what I'm saying? You
Right.
start making all of these decisions around something that has you have learned.
Mm.
And so here's the thing that's also wonderful about learned helplessness is it can be reversed into, vicarious self-efficacy. So if Dr. Joy walks through the door, gosh, maybe I can walk through the door. If my mother can walk through the door,
Right.
then maybe I can. But if they don't, surely if my mother can't go out the door, I can. That's vicarious learned helplessness. But we can reverse that, not by talking about it, but
Mm.
walk literally walking with people.
Mm.
And I said, come on, Alice, no, I don't know it. Come on. And next thing you know, Alice goes, wow, let me go get Edward and them.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Right.
And so
Now you
so
done
what we
started a movement.
there you go. We out. We
Mm.
out, right? So I think that there's so many layers to this. And because it has gone unobserved, because we're Black. Now they'll
Mhm.
look at everybody else.
Right.
Everybody else. But somehow Black people are not supposed to, again, they're so resilient. We're
Mm.
so, all of those things, it's like the strong Black woman, right? The same
Right.
thing. Next thing you know, you're not allowed to feel the full breadth of emotions, of
Right.
experience as a human being. And we hold that in our bodies. We hold that and don't even know why anymore.
Mm.
Right. And that's the trauma.
When it comes to the actions that you took in that analogy, where you tell Alice, "Come on, I'll walk with you," and that really speaks to me about the power of we sometimes call it mutual aid, but community organizing from the eye
Community.
level of the
Absolutely.
community, and when I first got my hands on the book, one of the things that I appreciated about what you were saying as it pertains to post traumatic slave syndrome was it felt like now I'm an attorney. I did not go to medical school. I wanted to be a doctor, but math and science and I didn't get along so well. So I went to law school. And one of the things that I so appreciated about this was that it felt like for the first time in my life, we had a medicalized understanding of the trauma. And it reminded me, because I often give this example. Like before, there was a time when being an alcoholic was not considered like a medical thing. Being addiction wasn't considered a medical issue. You were just a person who had low morals and bad home training, and you was a no good, very bad kind of person. It was about you as a moral failure. And then we understood about addiction. I think you've talked about this as well. We understood more about addiction, and so then we could have Alcoholics Anonymous. And now, decades after Alcoholics Anonymous is created, if I'm dealing with the addiction, or the disease of addiction, I can go online. I can call a sponsor. I can find an appointment tonight. I can find a spot to be in tonight where I will be able to be surrounded by a support group, an institution that has been intentionally designed to help me navigate this disease of addiction. And when I think about that, and I think about post-traumatic slave syndrome, it's this notion for me that if we have this medicalized space, and if white nationalism, I know we say white supremacy, I really don't like the phrase white supremacy, but for the purposes of this conversation, I'm going to use it because it's easy to understand. If white supremacy is a drug, for example, that we have been, as a result of this trauma, forcibly addicted to, then, and as a result, we have this disease of post-traumatic slave syndrome, then I would love Dr. Joy to be able to say, you know what? My reaction to white nationalism is really flaring up today. Let me go online, if I need a support group. I need a group therapy space, because I feel like we as Black people, we need a therapeutic environment wherein we can wrestle, which doesn't have anybody who's not dealing with the disease there. Like you can't come if you benefit from us being sick. But I feel like we need a similar sort of infrastructure that would allow us to proactively process through the syndrome so that we can get to healing, because it's one thing to name it. It's another thing to have a system in place that would allow us to navigate towards a healing journey. And I know there's a lot of organizing work that I've been doing with folks to sort of try to create that. But talk to us about what the healing aspect of this knowledge looks like. How do we practically make it accessible? If I am a bruh on the street, if I'm one of them corner boys, or if I'm in a corner suite, how do we create a space where, regardless of class and the various religions that we all subscribe to, where we can heal from this thing? What does that look like?
Okay, excellent. So let me first of all clarify, post-traumatic slave syndrome is not a diagnosis. Now, let me explain what that means.
Because I feel like it should be, Dr. Joy.
Yeah, but what we have to be very careful, because
Yes,
what I did not do, and very intentionally, I do not pathologize Black people. There's nothing wrong with us. You see, the moment you pathologize us, they go, oh, wait a minute, you got post-traumatic slave syndrome? Let's put it in the DSM. That's the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. Let's give it a code. And now you're going to pay me to fix it. Are you following me? And first of all, the reason why it's not that is not just for that reason, because it really isn't that, because post-traumatic slave syndrome requires, listen carefully, justice. Ooh. It requires justice. Because you see, if we just say, oh, let's find a day for y'all, let's find some way to put you on an insurance form so we can get paid for what, breaking your leg regularly. That's one. And the bottom line is, we are people that in truth are a miracle, because yes, we are adaptive. We've survived it, but not without scars.
Right.
And what I'm saying is, one, stop hitting me. You see, we have to do two things at the same time. We have to begin to have a space, right, which we are creating, healing circles, a space where we can say, wait a minute, and this is what Nana told me, and this is what happened to Grandpa, and now, oh no, this is not getting ready to happen to my child. Are you following me? We have to have prevention, but in order to do better, you got to know better. Right. And my work is really more around, what are you doing? And none of us do it perfectly. Trust me.
Right.
My daughter and I often say, we are the community we serve. We got the same issues.
Yes.
So it's not like I take myself out of it. I'm not. I'm in it too. But the bottom line is, we have to, one, have a space where we can acknowledge what is going on, exactly what you're doing, exactly the conversations, but with an understanding that this is not about, because on top of post-traumatic, you got all those other layers. issues of poverty,
Yes.
racism.
Yes.
You look at the dismantling of our history, the denial of our reality, the mistreatment in medicine, media, law, you name it. Every major institution in America has at its roots white nationalism, as you would call it, or white supremacy. It's governed by it.
Right.
So where are you going to go? That's why it requires social justice. But at the same time, I need to begin to look at how and why I move the way I do through the world. Right? I'll give you a perfect one. It's pretty innocuous, but I'm going to give you one that I grew up with. And I think I might have talked about it. I have so many stories, but all of my stories is based on my own reality. I didn't have to leave the house to write.
And they're all really good.
My mother used to tell me, and I don't know, you guys are in chapter 1. My mother used to say to me all the time, don't walk out the house eating. Simply, don't walk out the house eating. So I knew in my house, my mother and father weren't having it. You're not walking out the house eating, right? So, I got married, had children. My daughter, she's a teenager, had a sandwich. She's walking out the door. I said, don't walk out the door eating. And she did the miraculous thing. She said, why?
Why?
And I stopped and I went, because you don't do that.
This sounds like a conversation I just had with my daughter. Because
my kids don't stop with that. She goes, well, let's see. There are cafes outside. Let me see. There people have barbecues now. We have family reunions. And I go, because I said so. I said so. Just don't walk out the door, right? So then I stop and I'm going, why can't we walk out the door eating, right? So I tell this story. I'm in Chicago at a talk. After the talk, both my parents passed away. I never got a chance to ask them that question. But when this older gentleman came up to me and he said, where is your mother from? I said, my family's from Louisiana. He goes, oh, really? And he says, I'm probably about the age of your mother. He said, did you know that in Louisiana, when your mother was a child, that Black people couldn't come stand or sit in a restaurant and eat. They would be told, you have to take that out because there's no, and here's what happened. Years later, I'm in Brooklyn walking with my niece. We're walking down the street and we come to this, it's a antique shop. And I walk by and I see a sign. I have it in my house right now, framed. And it says, no colored seating. And all of a sudden it started rolling back.
Right.
My mother did not want to be reminded. Every time she saw us walk out the door, it triggered her injury. Don't you walk out that door eating. You just sit down. You can sit down right there and eat your food.
Wow.
Now it makes sense. So when I talk about the healing, stay with me. When people know better, they can do better.
Yeah.
I was continuing something that had nothing to do with me, but everything to do with my mother's injury. Everything to do with her shame. Do you see what I'm saying? Yeah. And it may seem innocuous, but thank God my children had a presence of mind to go, why? So that behavior stopped right there, never went any further in my family.